She said a stranger stole her car and her children. For 9 days, America searched in fear until the mother's mask cracked. In 1994, Susan Smith's tearful pleas for her kidnapped children gripped the nation.
I just want my baby back. Please, if anyone knows anything, please come forward.
But beneath the surface, a darker truth waited to be exposed, one that shocked even seasoned investigators. This is the story of a mother who blamed strangers and betrayed the very children she claimed to protect. Union was the kind of southern town where people waved at neighbors, where secrets were buried under layers of politeness and prayer. In the fall of 1994, the community was preparing for Halloween, but what they got was a nightmare. Susan Lee Vaughn Smith was a 23-year-old single mother of two, Michael, 3, and Alex, just 14 months old. Recently divorced, she lived in a modest home and worked as a secretary. Friends described her as soft-spoken, charming, maybe a little lonely, but underneath her gentle smile were scars, emotional ones. Susan had a history of depression, of abandonment, and, as would later come to light, of childhood trauma that shaped her adult relationships. On October 25, 1994, Susan frantically reported her car had been hijacked at a red light by an unknown black man. In the back seat were her 2 sons.
My babies, they're gone.
The story caught fire immediately. A frantic mother, 2 missing babies, a mysterious kidnapper. But something about the case didn't sit right with detectives. And over the next 9 days, their doubts would only grow. From the moment Susan Smith went public with her story, the nation responded with overwhelming sympathy. Her tearful press conferences played on every news station. Her trembling hands clutched a tissue as she begged the supposed carjacker to return her sons. Union County transformed overnight. Police set up roadblocks, searching for the burgundy Mazda she claimed was stolen. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods, forests, and lakes. Divers plunged into nearby bodies of water. Every truck stop and rest area became a potential clue. Media outlets flooded the area. National anchors arrived. Talk shows dissected the story. People across the country wrote letters, donated funds, and prayed. But while the cameras focused on Susan's tear-streaked face, investigators noticed something odd. Her timeline kept shifting. Her emotions, while outwardly raw, felt rehearsed. Investigators noted that she seemed calm at times, how eager she was to guide the narrative. Meanwhile, a composite sketch of the alleged carjacker was circulated, a vague image of a black man with a knit cap. Critics, particularly in communities of color, began questioning the racial overtones of the accusation. Some remembered the Central Park Five. Others recalled similar cases where black men were falsely accused. Still, the media ran with it until a break came, not from evidence, but from Susan herself. On November 3rd, 9 days after her original report, Susan asked to speak with investigators alone. And what she told them shattered the image of a desperate mother and replaced it with something far more chilling. Susan Smith sat quietly for a moment before whispering words that turned the case upside down. "My children are not with a stranger. They're in the lake." She confessed that she had fabricated the carjacking. There had been no black man, no red light abduction. The entire story, from the tearful news conferences to the composite sketch, had been a lie. The truth was far more horrifying. On the night of October 25th, Susan strapped her sons into their car seats, drove to John D. Long Lake, and released the handbrake. The Mazda rolled slowly forward into the dark, still water. The boys cried, the car sank, and Susan walked away. The nation gasped. Vigils turned into outrage. Sympathy turned to fury. And Susan's name, once whispered in prayer, was now spoken with disbelief and horror. Investigators immediately arrested her. The community that once embraced her now turned its back. But one question still haunted everyone. Why? Unraveling the answer to why led investigators and experts down a dark and deeply psychological path. Susan Smith wasn't a hardened criminal. She didn't fit the mold of a killer. But she also wasn't new to deception, manipulation, or mental instability. In her confession and subsequent interviews, Susan described overwhelming feelings of despair. She spoke of loneliness, rejection, and shame. But at the heart of her actions, prosecutors would argue, was a motive rooted in something terrifyingly cold: romantic rejection. Just weeks before the murders, Susan had been dating a man from a wealthy, well-known local family. Things were going well until he broke things off. In a heartbreaking letter he would later share with police, he explained he didn't want a long-term relationship with a woman who had children. That letter, that one rejection, became the trigger. Psychiatrists and investigators believe that Susan saw her sons not as cherished lives, but as obstacles to her own happiness. In her mind, if the children were gone, the relationship could be salvaged. In court, prosecutors painted this as the motive. She murdered her sons to remove the one thing that stood in the way of the future she wanted. But others saw something more layered. A woman raised in dysfunction, abandoned by her father to suicide, molested by her stepfather, and groomed to believe love required sacrifice. Her defense argued that Susan was mentally ill, suffering from depression and dependent personality disorder, that she wasn't evil, she was broken. Regardless of interpretation, one truth was clear: 2 innocent children were dead. And now, Susan would have to answer for it. Susan Smith's trial began in July 1995, less than a year after her confession. The prosecution sought the death penalty. Their narrative was blunt. Susan had murdered her children in cold blood to remove them as obstacles in her pursuit of a man who didn't want a family. In the courtroom, they showed the letter. They showed photos of the lake. They presented Susan's confession. But the defense presented a deeply human portrait of a woman teetering on the edge. They told of her father's suicide, of the molestation she endured from her stepfather, of her battles with mental illness and abandonment. Psychiatrists for the defense diagnosed her with major depressive disorder and dependent personality disorder. She was not a monster, they argued, but a product of lifelong emotional neglect and trauma, a young woman who saw no way out. The jury deliberated for days. In the end, they delivered a verdict: guilty of 2 counts of murder, but they spared her life. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She would become eligible in 2024. Since her sentencing, Susan Smith has served her time at the Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. Her prison years have been marked by controversy. She has been written up for sexual relationships with guards, violating prison rules and showing little remorse. In 2000, 2 prison employees were fired after engaging in inappropriate conduct with her. Still, she's also received letters of support from people who believe she was a victim of her circumstances, that her crimes, while inexcusable, were rooted in untreated trauma and desperation. Public opinion remains sharply divided. To some, Susan Smith is a cold-blooded killer who deserves no sympathy. To others, she's a tragic figure, a mentally unwell woman who snapped under pressure and pain. With her parole eligibility approaching, debates have reignited. Should Susan Smith be given another chance? Or should the memory of Michael and Alex be honored with continued justice? Only time and the parole board will decide. But in the court of public opinion, her name still sparks the same question: how could a mother do such a thing? The story of Susan Smith didn't fade with her conviction. In the years that followed, her case became a staple in the true crime canon, a reference point for betrayal, manipulation, and maternal filicide. Dozens of books were written. Documentaries dissected the timeline. Podcasters and YouTubers pored over every detail, trying to answer the question that still lingers today: what drives a mother to kill her own children? Susan's case sparked fierce debates about mental illness, race, and media responsibility. Many criticized how quickly the media amplified her false accusation against a black man, reinforcing dangerous stereotypes. Others examined how the media portrayed Susan herself, first as a grieving mother, then as a cold-hearted murderer. The shift was abrupt, from victim to villain, and for many, It exposed how media narratives are crafted and manipulated. True crime fans still revisit her story today, drawn by the shocking twist and tragic outcome. But beneath the salacious details lies a more sobering reality. Two boys, Michael and Alex, are gone, and they died believing their mother was driving them to safety. As parole approaches, their story has resurfaced once more. People ask, can someone who commits such a heinous act ever truly be rehabilitated? And more hauntingly, if Susan Smith walks free, what message does that send? As Susan's parole eligibility date draws near, public opinion is as divided as ever. For some, the 30-year sentence she received was more than enough. They argue she has served her time and should be evaluated like any other inmate, based on rehabilitation, remorse, and risk. But others, including many members of the victim advocacy community, believe her crimes are too egregious for release. The method, the motive, the betrayal of innocence. These, they argue, go beyond rehabilitation. Several former prosecutors who worked the case have spoken out, urging the parole board to consider the emotional damage inflicted, not just on Michael and Alex, but on an entire nation that watched their story unfold. Susan's defense team maintains that she has undergone counseling, worked jobs inside the prison, and has been a model inmate for over a decade. But her past infractions, including inappropriate relationships with prison staff, continue to cast a shadow over claims of reform. Meanwhile, the legacy of her sons lives on through memorials, photos, and documentaries. Michael loved fire trucks. Alex had just begun to walk. Family members described their laughter, their innocence, the way they clung to each other. Their story, tragically cut short, is now inseparable from Susan's. Every conversation about her future echoes with the voices of the past, and for many, those voices are too sacred to be silenced by a second chance. Nearly 3 decades after the crime, society continues to revisit Susan Smith's story, not just for its shock value, but for what it reveals about the human psyche, the justice system, and the power of narrative. Some experts now point out how Susan's early life may have laid the groundwork for her catastrophic decisions. Raised in a home plagued by dysfunction, Susan endured the suicide of her father at just 6 years old. She was later molested by her stepfather, a trauma she disclosed years before the murders, though it went largely ignored at the time. Psychologists suggest that repeated abandonment by male figures in her life may have shaped her deep-seated fears of rejection. Her identity, they argue, became dependent on external validation, especially from men. When that validation disappeared, so did her sense of worth. This doesn't excuse her actions, but it complicates them. Modern criminal psychology often aims not just to punish, but to understand. And Susan's case has become a lens through which evolving theories about trauma, personality disorders, and maternal identity are examined. At the same time, racial justice advocates have used the case to spotlight the damage caused by false accusations. The imaginary black carjacker, whom Susan claimed had taken her children, was a construct that weaponized racial fear. It misdirected an entire investigation and reinforced harmful stereotypes. This element of the case has sparked renewed dialogue around racial bias in both the criminal justice system and media narratives. If Susan had blamed a white man, would the story have received the same frenzied support? These conversations matter, not only because of what happened in 1994, but because similar dynamics still play out today. Susan Smith's crime was an anomaly in its cruelty, but not in its context. And it's in revisiting these painful truths that we move closer to preventing them from repeating. 3 decades later, experts still study Susan Smith's case not just as a tragedy, but as a multi-layered case study in criminal psychology, media ethics, and gendered violence. Dr. Elise Warren, forensic psychologist. Susan's case represents what happens when multiple forms of trauma go untreated. You don't just get a criminal, you get a symbol. Many professionals point to Susan as a quintessential example of dependent personality disorder, someone who bases their worth entirely on the opinions of others. Combine that with major depressive episodes and a lack of intervention, and the result is catastrophic. Others note that Susan weaponized her femininity and societal assumptions of motherhood. In those early days, the media treated her with a gentleness rarely afforded to male suspects. She wept on camera, and people believed her, until they didn't. In a post-truth era, Susan Smith's story warns us about the dangers of emotional manipulation, unchecked trauma, and media-driven narratives. It's not just about guilt or innocence. It's about what stories we believe and why. Susan's sons, Michael and Alex, never got a second chance. They didn't get therapy, they didn't grow up, they became symbols of lost innocence, of betrayed trust, of a justice system both effective and flawed. So we ask again, should Susan Smith be allowed to walk free? And if she does, what does that say about how we measure justice? What does that say about us? If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, we invite you to join the conversation. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like and share if you believe these stories deserve to be heard. And subscribe to Twisted Case for more in-depth, emotionally driven true crime documentaries. Because behind every headline lies a human story. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more gripping true crime breakdowns, mysteries, and criminal psychology stories. Only on Twisted Case.